Hello, my name is Eric Follick. I'm a Platonist contemplative ascetic and renunciant. I'd like to read for you a question that I received uh, from someone who saw my stuff on the internet, received by email, uh, about some unease about Nagarjuna and his Mulamadhyamakakarikas and how that might relate to Platonism or cause some conceptual difficulties for someone trying to practice Platonism or trying to practice Buddhism for that matter, or in fact, practice any spiritual practice for or tradition for that matter. And I've substantially abbreviated and edited the original question for this question and answer, and then it's followed by my reply. I hope this may be of some assistance to anyone who's uh, who's had these sort of questions or difficulties. Uh, so, also, if you'd like to see the written version of this, it's available at along with all my other writings at uh, my blogspot site, platonistasceticism.blogspot.com. That's platonistasceticism.blogspot.com. And it's also at my academia.edu page at independent.academia.edu slash Eric, ERIC, Follick, F as in Frank, ALLICK, no space between Eric Follick and the initial letters capitalized. Okay, so here we go. The This question and answer on Nagarjuna and the MMK. So here is the question. Nagarjuna's Mulamadhyamaka contains various refutations of causation, change, quote, self-existence, unquote, essence, swabhava, and that perceptions and conceptions thereof are illusory, and there is only thusness or tatata. For example, his tetralemma about causation comes to the conclusion that a thing could neither arise from something identical nor from something different, nor from both or neither. I will ignore the last one as I'm not sure anyone actually believes something can be derived from nothing. Therefore, causation cannot actually take place. This is not only an attack on causation, but also essence. The Platonist position in this framework, I suppose, would be closest to three. The effect of a cause is both identical and different from that which is caused, yet still possesses a certain self-existence essence. We do not claim that it possesses independent existence other than the one who is beyond existence, nor do I think any spiritual system does. To Nagarjuna, this position is absurd. How could an essence that belongs wholly to itself and is by nature eternal be caused and cause something posterior to it in turn, and in the case of the eternal soul, undergo any sort of change? How do we square away the ascent of the soul from bodily existence to the absolute if it is by nature unchangeable, especially since the intermediate, nous, the divine mind, is itself atemporal and the soul would have to reside there before finally rejoining the one? On a related note, if the soul once fully identified with the one, then how could rejoining the one be permanent? This implies that the state it had before its, quote, fall, unquote, from the one was in some ways imperfect, but the state it acquired after rejoining the one permanently is more perfect or absolutely hyper-perfect. All of these issues can be extrapolated, I think, from Nagarjuna's MMK, and that given all these contradictions, it seems erroneous to think in terms of essence, change, and causation as Nagarjuna claims. Now, let me state that I don't believe Mahayana Buddhism actually escapes these conundrums. There's a not so subtle sophistry in their claim that while conventional reality is illusory, we can still use it to arrive at thusness, as this implies that the illusion somehow participates in ultimate reality, meaning instead of being totally and fully illusory, there are degrees of reality. This is no different from what we call ontology. In fact, it mirrors the Platonian model of reality. The conventional reality we perceive, instead of being totally illusory, is therefore but a mirror image of actual reality. Of course, at the level of the absolute, there is no causation, change, movement, difference, etc. However, if we follow Nagarjuna's logic to its actual conclusion, instead of the sophistic escape of the two truths doctrine, there would actually be no way for anything to derive anywhere meaningful. In short, Nagarjuna's conclusions are as absurd, if not more so, than that which he refutes. All this infers that Nagarjuna's conclusions must in some important ways be erroneous, and that at the very least, Mahayana Buddhists do not truly believe what the MMK states and escape from their own philosophical foundations by means of sophistry and rhetorical sleights of hand. However, is just that, inference and not a direct confrontation with Nagarjuna's claims. The actual truth behind the MMK, contra to what Nagarjuna himself claims, would be a sort of staticness and an absolute untruth that we could never hope to escape. The only other option would be a sort of ontology, and it is telling that Mahayana Buddhism sneakily adopted for the latter. However, I find myself unsatisfied by this indirect refutation and at unease. I believe there must be some way to directly confront Nagarjuna's reasoning instead of merely pointing out the absurdity of his consequences. Okay, so that is the abbreviated and edited version of the rather lengthy and technical inquiry that I received. And it actually, the inquirer himself apologized for its length and technical nature, and that he understood that this is just conceptual or level of discursive thought and not of practice, but he felt that he had to resolve these as for the discursive understanding to be a stepping stone, as he put it, in the path of actual contemplation and practice. Okay, so that is the question, and here is my response. I wouldn't worry about all this stuff. These concerns are not necessary and are not based on valid assumptions. Nagarjuna's, the MMK's analysis or quote logic, unquote, along with the doubts that it makes you give rise to, is based on invalid, realist or nominalist, non-idealist and unexamined premises that limit reality and the possibilities and explanations just to the lowest phenomenal level, which has minimal reality. These questions and supposed contradictions about causation, change, etc., could only arise if the attempt to explain causation, etc., is limited to just the lowest plane of phenomenal and supposedly material things. Causation and phenomenal spatial and temporal change are readily understood without contradiction as the projection of the order and structure of nous onto or into the lower level of non-being, as the life of soul in time and space, unwilling to take the whole of nous all at once. There is only, as Plotinus puts it in Ennead 3:8, contemplation, stronger and weaker, fuller and less full, complete and incomplete, clearer and more obscure, but still only contemplation. The one good is the completely full, clear contemplation. The life of the most degraded souls is the weakest, most incomplete and dark contemplation. The ascent and also the descent of the soul is just a change in the state of contemplation. So there is no problem of an eternal essence undergoing some sort of change, analogous to a sort of physical change. Also, it is not like the soul was a physical part of the one before its fall, and then physically rejoins the one, as the language of your doubt seems to tacitly suppose. The potential for not knowing is present within knowing. The potential for darkness is present within light, for non-being within being. When the soul completes contemplation and fully knows and becomes the light, the not knowing and darkness and non-being is gone. You don't have to worry about it recurring. All this is actually kind of ineffable and only really known in contemplative ascetic experience, since all this discussion and questions and process only occurs at the lowest and least real level. Nagarjuna, the MMK, is maybe just being what the Platonic dialogues call an antilogikos, or a sophist taking refuge in the darkness of non-being. Perhaps you might want to review the discussion about not becoming misologikos, that refers to antilogikos people that are pleased within themselves when they turn everything up and down to make it seem that no definite conclusions are possible in the Phaedo at 89b to 90d. Actually, it wouldn't be a bad idea to read the whole Phaedo carefully, say 52 or 100 times. And there are other parts of the Phaedo that deal with these questions also. Other dialogues also deal with this problem and the kind of difficulties that the antilogikoi and sophists of the world cause. You also may want to eventually read through all of the Enneads, even though this is a big project, and you won't likely understand much of what you read for a long time, as Plotinus deals with the kinds of concerns you have. You don't have to be able to understand everything at the discursive level before proceeding with the ascesis. Indeed, it is impossible to do so. And being and working, that is working at the ascesis, at the practice, as a celibate, vegan, teetotaling, etc., ascetic practicing contemplation, is as necessary for coming to even a discursive level understanding of these things as racking your brains over Nagarjuna's attempts at logical contortion. I don't know if it will be of any help or interest, but here is a link with an added introduction of the original sort of non-sectarian version of one of my pieces that perhaps you have seen in the specific Platonist form that I was asked several years ago to write for an Old English Indian magazine. And I can't reproduce the link here, but it's, well, you can see it on the written versions that I mentioned above, or if you go to csp.indica, indica.in, and then it's the article is an Indo-Hellenistic Understanding of Contemplative Asceticism by Eric S. Follick. It's from May of 2020. Perhaps it will be of some consolation to you to see that there is a great deal one can do to proceed on the path, and that the essentials of doing so are clear, even before necessarily resolving all the possible conceptual doubts that may arise on reading the different texts of the different systems. So there is the question about Nagarjuna and the MMK, and my reply, which I hope is helpful. And I'd just like to add, in addition, that the path is extremely difficult and extremely long. It covers many births and many years in this birth. There can be many conceptual confusions along the way. One can't expect to understand everything all at once, or that everything will be immediately clear to the discursive intellect. It's very, very difficult, not the easy things some people might imagine, to come in contact directly with nous, or even more so with the one or the good, and then to have direct, unmediated knowledge of how these things are and how these things work. But your understanding does, of course, improve as you go along the path. And as I hope I've tried to make clear, that the basic outlines of the Indo-Hellenistic contemplative ascetic path are very clear, crystal clear, and you can begin to follow them without and follow them vigorously and wholeheartedly and sincerely, without having immediately resolved every possible conceptual contradiction or argument that could come up, like especially if you compare these different systems or you read what different people in the different systems complain about concerning each other, or even especially if you read the things that modern uh, professor types and modern people write about these systems just from a purely modern discursive standpoint without much understanding, and which can create a lot more confusion in the mind of a practitioner and and so forth. So I think that even if you're not can understand every point that you read or are not clear in everything, there's still no reason to be doubtful or unease, and there's still much you can do, and everything will become clear enough in time. Also, I would point out that in addition, that the predominant dominant naturalism or materialism in the philosophical sense, or positivism, the anti-transcendence, anti-intellectualism, all the things that are the dominant and official dogma of the modern world, uh, can also make these things more difficult to understand. Like I hope I pointed out clearly enough in this reply to the questioner, that so much of this confusion arises because people, especially now, are so limited just to the lowest, least real level of phenomenal reality, and can't see any way out of that. And so are confused naturally, because this level is confusing and confused and is not real, and no true knowledge is actually possible of the sensory realm. True knowledge is of the higher hypostases, of the forms, of the nous, the divine mind thought, of the good and the one. And as I mentioned just now, attaining that direct, ultimate true knowledge is very difficult and not at all the easy thing that many moderns might suppose. Generally, moderns vastly, vastly, vastly underestimate the the difficulty of the path in spiritual practice and attainment, and vastly, vastly overestimate, overvalue their own understanding, and particularly the understanding of modernity, and don't seem to think there's any other way out of it. So the way to deal, as I hope I was indicating in my response, the way to understand and deal with these things is not really to get sucked into the darkness of non-being or semi-being, and to along with the sophists and the anti-logikoi and the materialists and naturalists and discursive arguers and so forth, but to pop up and transcend that and see it from a higher level, and a better metaphysics that would allow, at which point the contradictions are resolved. So anyway, I hope this is maybe of some help to somebody, to the original questioner, and maybe to some of the people out there who might see this. Uh, uh, Platonism is less popular now, to say the least, or real practice of Platonism, than Buddhism, even the silly pseudo-Buddhism of modernity, and particularly of the modern West. But it may be that there's but to come to an actual understanding and practice of Platonism in these days, you pretty much have to come from a background in one of the Dharmic systems and practice in one of the Dharmic systems, uh, rather than in the modern professorial presentation of Platonism. So it's certainly possible that the kind of doubts and misgivings that this very astute and insightful and sincere questioner was troubled by, and that so since these doubts might arise, maybe this will be helpful to somebody, and maybe someone else making a transition from Buddhism to Platonism, uh, like I myself did decades ago, and others do. So anyway, thank you for listening and watching, and I hope you enjoyed it and it is some benefit. Take care. As in the Plato would say, "Eu prate," which in Greek would mean literally fare well. So do fare well on your practice on the path. Okay, thank you. Bye bye.